Well guys, welcome back to the channel. It's been a very long time indeed since I posted, and I do apologize for that. Life gets in the way. Anyway, I thought I would bring up a subject. It came up the other day. I was watching another YouTube channel, and they had on Bob Rock, famous producer, engineer behind the likes of Motley Crue, Metallica, etc., etc. And I don't really know Bob Rock's work outside of those two bands, I've got to be honest. But I do respect the man as a producer and what he knows as an engineer. So when he says things, I take them seriously. But anyway, they were talking about, production and how it's changed through the ages. How has his workflow changed, especially with the advent of digital audio workstations, things like Pro Tools, Logic, that kind of thing. And obviously he was talking about the speed at which you can operate, the convenience of plugins, over and above having to use analog gear. And he was talking about the crossover point where there was a time where digital just didn't sound good enough, and so they primarily used analog for most of the obviously the recording process in particular, and the mixing process, and then later on how it would still be analog recording, but then digital mixing became viable, and then eventually when digital sounded good enough, then everyone sort of went to recording in the box, so to speak. But one of the topics that came up, which I thought was really interesting, was when they asked him about his view on things like Autotune. And when they say Autotune, they mean pitch correction. In the studio, you're talking about pitch correction. Autotune is really a live thing, where you basically tell the system, here's the key that the vocalist is performing in, and it'll modulate any notes that are slightly sharp or flat and back into the key that they're singing. With varying degrees of effectiveness depending on how old the software was. If it's a modern version, it does that a lot more intuitively, you might say, and effectively. But things can still go wrong when you're playing live, and so there's a lot of artists that still wouldn't be comfortable using that kind of software, and those that do have had the occasional accident and been found out for using it. But pitch correction in particular is a little bit of a different thing. That's when you go in and you actually manipulate the specific notes, note by note, if necessary, and snap them up to kind of standard 440 pitch. And so his opinion, his take on it was really interesting, which was that he was kind of surprised that people get so upset about the use of Autotune these days, because he says that they've been doing it the whole time since the 80s. And this bit in particular made me laugh, because what he said was, what they used to do was record the vocal, and then any bits that needed polishing, they would then cut that tape, transfer that over to another player to record back on to the actual tracks, and they would speed it up or slow it down as required to get it to pitch. And it made me giggle. So he was like, well, so we've been using Autotune, we've been doing that since the 80s. But it made me laugh. It's like, come on, Bob, that's not Autotune, that's manual tune. That's some guy sitting there with a tape player, and like cranking the speed up and down and stuff, trying to get it like just bang on perfect. So that kind of tickled me and made me laugh. But I see his point. His point is that people have been polishing vocal performances after the fact for now what would be 45 years, which is an insanely long period of time, really, when you think about it. That's presuming what he meant was that it came in the early 80s, which I can believe. The technique of manually tuning it. So that was one interesting take, and kind of funny. But something occurred to me during all of this, which was, I think one key difference, and you can tell me what you think about this in the comments, but one key difference with what was going on in the 80s and 90s, and I would say has steadily decreased with over time, particularly in the pop industry. Pop and R&B, I would say, are worst affected by it. I would say rock music, metal music in general. I think there is an inclination for performers to want to perform the part as best as they can, and they'll spend the time in the studio if the budget allows. You know, they'll do as many takes as it takes to get the performance as good as they can get it, and rely less on software intervention in post-production. When you listen to pop music these days, and R&B definitely in particular, which has dominated the pop charts for the last few years, it seems to be on the decline just very recently, if you believe what Rick Beato is saying. You can hear the artifacts, you can hear the adjustments, you can hear in the harmonies where it sounds like it is just being played by a MIDI keyboard, and the vocals are basically being keyed off of that, and the notes are just snapped to, just kind of quantized and snapped to 440, and it's too perfect. So it sounds like a synthesizer, because really it is a synthesizer at that point. Just based on a sample of a human voice. I think when you listen to rock and metal albums, you hear less of this. That's not to say you don't hear any of it, but you hear a lot less intervention. And then because the performances, they've done their best to do the best performance that they can, you won't hear the software working quite as hard. And then there'll be parts that they leave, because as a production style choice that they might leave. Now it depends on how polished the album is. And this is something that I would say to Bob Rock is, when he says what's all the fuss about, I think he needs to remember that even in the 80s and 90s, although it was the fashion to have very high definition, high-end production for the most part, and then in the 90s that sort of changed, with Nirvana and the Seattle scene coming in, then obviously there was a move towards, kind of going more towards maybe a garage sound, not necessarily not like lo-fi, not as much as that, but if you think like Steve Albini or something like that, not far off that, you know what I mean, like just the sound of a band in a room, and not a whole ton of like compression tricks and like EQ moves, not nearly as much sculpting of the sound, or like striving towards like sort of a sonic perfection or a stage-like sound, less ambience or a different kind of ambience, that kind of thing. I mean, like Steve Albini is famous for having like his drums sound like they were recorded in a kitchen, and sometimes they were, that kind of way. So yeah, there's definitely, I would say, a personal preference thing here. So I would ask you, like, what do you prefer? Do you prefer something that is, would you like an album to be crafted to perfection? And if so, how much intervention, post-production intervention, are you comfortable with? Do you think pitch correction is okay? I kind of think of the likes of, say, a Freddie Mercury or something like that in the studio doing take after take. Even a Michael Jackson, if you take a pop example. And these guys were pretty much bang on the money, with their performances. They would just do take after take until they got it right. And that's not to say that nobody fiddled with it afterwards. Who am I to say? I don't have the production notes. Maybe some of you guys who are deeper into engineering and production than I am, you might know. If you do, leave them, again, please bring it into the comments. I want to hear or want to discuss. But how much polishing do you think is justified? And I think that's the way to draw the line is, is it a case that you are polishing a diamond? Or are you trying to reverse engineer a turd to become a diamond? And in the old days, it used to be the case that you couldn't polish a turd. And I think the key difference now is that you can kind of polish a turd. Even if it's a pretty turd, it's still a turd. So what do I mean by that? You might have a musician that's kind of been picked from the wrong reasons. They have the social media following, they're good looking, they're prepared to dress kind of sexy or whatever, market themselves with their body. It happens. And maybe they're not that great of a singer, and they don't write their own songs, But it's about what can they market. And you hear stories from engineers about having to work with these kinds of people in the studio, and it being a real chore to try to scrape it all together and make it stick. Then on the opposite side of it, you've got great bands or even great solo artists who really are good. They craft their own material. They're well rehearsed. They come in prepared, and they come in, and the performance is not the hard part. The bit that they work hard towards is the creative decisions. It's like, yeah, they've already got a good song. Yeah, you can already sing it well, and there's a good arrangement. And so now it's about embellishing it and taking it from being something that's great to hear, maybe played on an acoustic guitar or just with piano accompaniment, and turning that into a production. With multiple instruments and layers and backing vocals and different things that come in, that kind of thing. That approach, I think, no one would argue against, even if you're someone who doesn't particularly like big grandiose production. I think you can still respect the craftsmanship in that. Like I said, it requires the talent, it requires the practice, it requires the maturation of your craft, and then this working together with a team, with a good producer, a good engineer, good mix engineer, that kind of thing, recording engineer, mix engineer. There's a team of people, there's a crew involved, maybe a band. It takes a lot to bring it together, and then once the sum of all those parts come together, you get something amazing out of it on the other end. What's kind of happening, obviously, though, in modern R&B, and I think what's putting people off of this idea of Autotune and these tools, it's not that they're used per se, it's that they're used to artificially elevate something that would otherwise be quite mediocre. And I think you can really hear it in the songs, because there's a lazy 2-bit drum loop. If you're lucky, maybe you might get a decent bass line on it, but then you get this vocal that is just kind of child's play. And then it's modulated the hell out of whack, and there's nothing natural about it. And there's no soul there left anymore, if there was any soul to begin with. And when it's modulated that heavily, you have to wonder, how bad was it that it had to be nudged in all these directions? Sometimes it is a stylistic choice. I get that. Where they want that sure, like, God knows why you'd want that, but if that's what you want, then, have at it. But I think people are sick and tired of it, increasingly so, more and more as we go along here. And so when he wonders, Bob Rock, what the fuss is about, I think that sums it up in a nutshell, is that people are kind of sick of, in an age where we're going to now be dominated by AI, people are going to lose their jobs to AI, people are having their music stolen by AI, people are going to start making films using AI talent instead of human talent to render CGI scenes and things like that. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of middlemen that are going to become inconvenient, that are going to get pushed out. And I think in this kind of day and age, I think people are going to start wanting more organic, more authenticity. You see it already here in YouTube, the way people look for authenticity. And that's, I think it's becoming more prevalent. It's still kind of underground, but there's a feeling, there's a vibe that people are starting to, the winds are starting to change on a lot of different things. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your take on it. How much production is too much production? And if you're a musician, do you use pitch correction? Do you think it's a necessity? Do you think people use it too liberally and as a crutch? And just give me a general vibe on this. I'd be interested to hear. Right, guys, that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you on the next one. Take care. Bye bye.